up, YouTube? Welcome back to Common Sense, Logic, and Reason. And as always, thank y'all for joining me today. And in this video, I wanted to go back or revisit this idea of mass incarceration of black people. And this is a common excuse that you often hear used by the race hustlers, as to deflect away from personal responsibility, and whenever you bring up the mass crime committed by blacks, they would run from it, dance, avoid it like the plague. They would dance around it like Indians dance around the campfire, telling tribal stories. But they totally ignore or deflect or run from the idea of mass crime. Well, in come Michelle Alexander. If you're not familiar with her, she's a civil rights lawyer, activist. They're all activists. And she's the author of the Race Hustler Bible. That's the book, The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in an Age of Colorblindness. In this book, she says that there's a new Jim Crow being waged against black people by way of the war on drugs. She pins everything on the war on drugs. And how, again, this is a new Jim Crow being waged by blacks, and which is utter nonsense. But I saw her give a lecture. I saw this YouTube video of her giving a lecture, and I'll put a link in the description. And a part of this lecture that I'm focusing on is that she attempted to try to address the crime rate issue when everybody talks about how blacks committing crimes at higher rates. So she attempts to try to explain it away, or try to explain why the crime rates committed by blacks don't justify the incarceration rate. And she tried her best, which was also ultimately a failed attempt. But she used several examples of why the mass crime committed by blacks doesn't justify the incarceration rate, or this quote-unquote mass incarceration that they often cry about. One of the issues that she talked about was she tried to make this comparison between the crime rates in America as well as the incarceration rates in America over the last 30 years. During that time period, we saw that the crime rates basically fluctuated, while at the same time the incarceration rates of Americans soared. And she interpreted that as Jim Crow against blacks, because blacks are incarcerated at such a high rate. So therefore it's, systemic white supremacy and racism against blacks. Well, how exactly is the incarceration rate increasing, especially in light of the war on drugs? How is that a new Jim Crow against blacks? And how is it waged against blacks, a new Jim Crow against blacks, but not new Jim Crow against any other race of people? That doesn't make that, again, that makes no sense, and that's just a flawed interpretation. But is it possible for the crime rates to stay the same and incarceration rates increase? Well, yeah. It's, again, especially considering the attention and the war on drugs. The war on drugs, if they put a heavy emphasis on dealing with crime, well, of course, you can see the incarceration rate climbing, increasing, while crime rates basically fluctuating. But in no way, shape, or form is that evidence of any Jim Crow being waged against black people. Again, if you commit crime in mass, don't be surprised if you're incarcerated in mass. Another argument that she brought forth is that the war on drugs was basically waged after we saw this decline in crime that you often hear liberals pull out, whenever it's convenient. Well, this decline in crime started in 1990. In 1990, we saw basically a reduction of a sharp increase in crime in America. And in 1991, we saw its decline start. But according to her, the war on drugs was waged after this decline. So therefore, it wasn't really needed. It was only waged against the black man with no evidence, of course. But the war on drugs was first implemented by Nixon in the 70s. And the expand on the war on drugs was implemented in the mid-80s by Reagan with the full support of the Congressional Black Congress as well as other black leaders because of the crack epidemic that hit the streets of the black community the hardest. They supported it, and in many of the cases they pushed for the expand on the war on drugs because of that crack epidemic. So, but that still doesn't change, again, the fact that, let me say it again, that if you don't mess with drugs, you don't get caught up in the drug lifestyle, you don't get around those people, then the drug war won't be waged against you. So this is just, again, it's just deflecting away from personal responsibility. But if the war on drugs was implemented before, then how can she say that it was implemented after? That would be a lie. Now I'm guessing what she's talking about is what Bill Clinton added to the war on drugs. Well, that happened after the decline, but the war on drugs was long established long before that. The thing that gets me about these race hustlers, though, and liberals, is that they always try to downplay the impact of the war on drugs in that decline. You know, as if the war on drugs had nothing to do with the decline, it was other means. But the facts, factually speaking, the peak drug arrest in America was 1989. The reduction of the increase in crime happened in 1990. If I'm not a betting man, but if I was a betting man, I would have to say my money would be on the war on drugs having a significant impact in crime rate. I mean, if you're arresting the drug dealers, you're putting them behind bars, so therefore they're not on the street committing crime and all the rest of the criminals, then wouldn't that mean that the crime rate could possibly drop because of that? I mean, that's complete plausible logic. If you put criminals in jail and they're not on the street to commit crime, well, the crime rates would significantly drop. Well, what's the excuses from the race hustlers? Well, they, again, aside from completely downplaying the impact of the war on drugs and the expand of the war on drugs by Reagan had on crime, they come up with other things like it's economics. You know, where it was economics, all these people got all these jobs, and since they don't have jobs, they don't have to commit crime anymore. You know, they pull out the correlation doesn't equal the causality argument. They pull that argument all the time, especially when it comes down to, you know, the stop and frisk and the reduction of crime in New York. You know, immediately after the implementation of stop and frisk in New York, we saw that sharp reduction in crime. But they insist that, you know, it has that stop and frisk had nothing to do with it, and there's really no evidence to support it. But I mean, that's a strong correlation. But by the way, these are the same people who always say that, you know, correlation doesn't equal the causality, are the same people saying that poverty causes crime, even though that's a complete correlation versus causality argument that with no evidence to support. But they believe that they believe the correlation causes causality as soon as it's convenient for their argument. But that's the hypocrisy of the left. Another thing that she talked about in this video, she brought up, you know, those quote unquote studies that show that white people use drugs just as much as black people. Well, she brought that alleged, you know, those studies, and you often hear the race hustlers bring these quote unquote studies and say that white people use drugs at the same rate as which black people are. Well, we know the rule when it comes down to liberals is never what they tell you. It's always about what they don't tell you. So what did she not say about these quote unquote studies? Well, what she didn't say is that they were in fact surveys where they ask people if they use drugs or not. And I'm guessing they take that people, in this case, that everybody's honest and everyone's going to tell the truth. So they ask people, have they used drugs, which usually is usually within the last 30 days, and the people tell them it's complete gospel truth. But here's the problem with that. Another thing that she didn't tell you about these quote unquote surveys, these studies, is that when they were actually backed up with drug tests, hair or urine sample, the evidence shows that blacks were overall several times more likely to have lied about the use of drugs. Of course, she leave that part out. And certain drugs, for say opium, it showed that white people were slightly more likely to lie, but black people overall were several times more likely to lie, which basically destroys the legitimacy of the accuracy of these alleged studies or surveys. And this is what they're basing the whole narrative that white people use drugs at a higher rate than black people on. So therefore, it must be systemic white supremacy that blacks are in jail at a higher rate. Well, they base the whole argument on these damn surveys and all the accuracy of a survey. Another issue that she brought up in this video is she gave us this, at the start of it, she gave us this sad sob story of this young man who came to our office and was trying to get help, that he was arrested and had drugs planted on him, and he took the plea deal because he didn't want to spend 10 years in jail, and thus has a criminal past that's going to impact him all his life. Now, also, the police officers in this particular area, wherever it is, they had a track record of doing the same to others, these corrupt police officers. The thing is that, if this is true, and this young man had his life impacted like that, then my heart goes out to him. And if it's true about this police department and all the corruption, then they should have been addressed and dealt with, and they should be put in jail. But they act as blacks throw this around as if all these police officers, the black people in jail, all these black folks in jail because some police officers planted drugs on them. Well, what percentage of black people are in jail for having drugs planted on them? Is it 10%? 20%? I mean, what is it? Because we have to show evidence of this to show that it's widespread, or before we can say that it's widespread, we have to show the evidence of it. I mean, you can't say that this is something that's widespread or cry about it all the time, and 2% of black people who are in jail for drug possession are in there because somebody planted drugs on them. Well, that's not widespread. But again, they never give you this evidence. You never hear this. They never come out with the evidence and proof and show you that all these black people are in jail because they've had drugs implanted on them. They just assume it. And another issue that you often hear from black people when it comes down to drugs, or one thing that you often hear we all deflect and dance around is that the whole idea of accessory to. How many blacks are in jail for drug possession that's accessory to something else? If you are, you're speeding in your car and the cops pull you over and they suspect that you have drugs on you and they find drugs on you, well, you got to pull over for speeding, but then you also get arrested for an accessory to having possession of drugs. So how many blacks are in jail for committing other crimes, and drugs is accessory to it? Let's look at New York with stop and frisk. Now, she cried in the video that 90% of all stop and frisk was implemented against blacks, but she never tell us what's the rate of crime that blacks committed, though. She completely left that one out. And if blacks are committing crimes at the highest rate and at significantly higher rates than anybody else, then wouldn't logic dictate that stop and frisk would be implemented against blacks? What the problem is, I mean, if you have, let's say that you have your children in school, you have 3 children. One of your children is an A student, honor roll student. Another child is an average C student, and your other third child is failing. If you're going to hire a tutor, why would you hire a tutor for your honor roll student? Obviously, your attention and focus is going to be on your student that's failing. So if the highest rates of crime is amongst blacks, in New York, well, was amongst blacks, and it still is amongst blacks in New York, well, wouldn't that be the bulk of your attention? So if I'm going to stop and frisk somebody or suspect someone, then it's going to be who basically the evidence has shown commits highest crime rates was the black people. So how do you cry about stop and frisk being implemented against blacks at a high rate, but ignore that you commit crime at a high rate? Again, ignore the mass crime again is ridiculous. But if I'm a black person in New York during stop and frisk, and I have drugs on me, and I get stopped and frisked, and the police find drugs, well, that's an accessory to. So again, how many blacks are in jail for with drug possession that's is accessory to something else? I mean, if we're going to talk about the fact that blacks are in jail for drug possession at higher rates, well, if you commit crime at higher rates and you get caught with drugs on you with an accessory, I mean, you can expect it. There'll be a high rate of accessory charges of drugs. But anyway, this is why, again, this video, as I look back on this video is a perfect example. Again, it's why I always hammer the point that you have to have the facts, you have to have the info. Because, I mean, could you imagine the people sitting in that auditorium, listening to her lecture, and they don't know these facts? Well, they can easily be swayed by the argument. And that's why you see so many apologetic whites out there crying about the book, her book, the New Jim Crow, because they aren't armed with the facts. On the other hand, imagine a person in that audience who's armed with the facts and who's like, well, hey, that's bullshit what she's saying. Who could call out on her bullshit, or who at least would be susceptible to the bullshit because they know the fact. This is why it's so important to know, and because knowing is half the battle. And that's why I'm producing these videos, so that people may know. And as always, y'all, until next time.